Why are we talking about books today? Because last Sunday, which was the Hebrew date, the 5th day of the month of Teves, the Rebbe declared that day to be a day for books, for Jewish books, for Torah books. It's based on a very sad and tragic event that turned out to be positive in the end. The Rebbe inherited the leadership of the Chabad movement from his father-in-law. His father-in-law had an incredible Judaic library that he took out of the Soviet Union with him. When the previous Rebbe was arrested and sentenced to death, and then the death sentence was eventually commuted to exile, and he was released from exile, the Soviet government wanted him out of Russia because he was considered to be the biggest counter-revolutionary. And he refused to leave unless he can take his library with him. His library then consisted of about, this is what I heard, about 30,000 volumes. It's quite an incredible collection. And they agreed. And he took his library with him, and he moved there to Latvia, then to Poland, and then ultimately he escaped the Nazis, and he came to the United States in 1940 with his library. When he passed away 10 years later in 1950, the Rebbe succeeded as the leader of the Chabad movement, so it would make sense that the Rebbe would inherit the library. Without going into the negative details, a relative of the Rebbe claimed that he was the owner of the library, and the Rebbe never contested that. The Rebbe did not want to create any type of division. But then, in the 1980s, this individual started to steal books from the library, books that were worth tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. These were books that came from a period, the first century of the printing press. Those books are incanubula, something like that. I'm mispronouncing it. It's an Arabic word, actually. It means the first editions that are published works. And he stole those books because one of the people working in the library noticed that books were missing, precious books were missing, and they put cameras in and they discovered who it was. And the person claimed that he was the heir to it. He was a relative, so he was entitled to it. And the Rebbe said, there are no heirs to it. It's a public library. It's a library that belongs to the community. And if the Rebbe is the leader of the community, then it's entrusted in his possession to. So he wouldn't go to a rabbinical court, this relative. Instead, they went to the civil courts, and the judge finally ruled that the library belongs to the Rebbe, belongs to the community, and the Rebbe being the leader of the community. It's just one of the depositions that the Rebbe's wife had to give. The lawyers of the other side were trying to entrap her, to get her to say that the library belonged to her father. So they asked her, after interrogation for hours, to whom does the library belong? Does it belong to your father, to the Rebbe, who was the previous Rebbe, or to the Hasidim? And she said, my father and the library belong to the Hasidim. And the lawyer got so upset that he threw his pencil. He said he realized he lost the case with that testimony. At any rate, the ruling was given on the day, the Hebrew date is the 5th day of Teves. It was appealed, and the appeal was lost. They lost the appeal, and the books were finally returned. So the Rebbe designated this day a day in which people should invest in buying Jewish books, Torah books, and it became a holiday of books. Maybe the first time in history that we celebrate Jewish books. Just when we reflect on how the previous Rebbe looked at his library, it wasn't looked upon as a private thing, because why would he risk his life for a library? It wasn't. He didn't consider it to be a private thing. It belonged to the Jewish people, and it was something for which he was willing to risk his life. Because if the Soviet regime said, no, you can't take the library, and you know what? You're not leaving the Soviet Union. We'll put you back in prison and we'll restore the death penalty. He could have lost his life. I was in Crown Heights last Sunday. There were literally long lines of people lining up to buy Jewish books. In all the Jewish bookstores, there were about 5 of them in Crown Heights that I know of, and you had to wait who knows how long in order for you to be able to buy books. That's how much, and not only in Brooklyn, but all over the world, this became a day in which we buy books. So let's try to understand what is so special about Jewish books. Jews are known as the people of the book. They always valued Torah books, Jewish books. And I remember we had a cleaning lady a few years ago, and she was cleaning my house, and she saw all the books in my house. I have a few dozen. And she said, you have to get rid of those books. They're in the way. It's like saying, what are these people doing in your house? Get rid of them. For us, the books are like an extension of yourself. And just like you don't get rid of yourself, hopefully, you don't get rid of your books. To the point where associations were made between the burning of books, which is something that tragically happened throughout Jewish history, that the enemies of the Jewish people realized that the way to get even with them, the way to punish them, if you can't kill them, kill their books, destroy their books. The famous Talmudic sage, Rabbi Hananiah ben Tradion, who was one of the 10 celebrated martyrs who died because he publicly taught Torah, how did they execute him? They wrapped his body with a Torah scroll and put it on fire. So they realized that by burning the Torah scroll, they were burning apart an extension of this rabbi as well, and that would cause the destruction of the Jewish people's commitment to Judaism. When we say special dirges, the prayers that we say on Tisha B'Av, the national day of mourning because of the destruction of the 2 temples, one of them is about the burning of Jewish books. I think it was the one who was referred to as Saint Louis. Very, very much of a saint he was, I'm sure, because he ordered the copies of the Talmud burnt, and they collected 24 wagon loads of Talmuds, and they had them all dumped into the fire. This was one of the greatest tragedies for the Jewish people, because you have to remember, this is in the, which century was this? The 12th century, I think. The Talmud was only handwritten. The Talmud is about 20 times maybe more than the size of the Bible. And it had to be handwritten, and you had 24 wagon loads. You could imagine how much work went into that, and to replace it was going to be a major challenge.
Was it handwritten because printing hasn't been developed yet?
Right, there were no printing presses yet.
Now you can have a Gemara.
Right, now everything is printed, but there you had to have people who literally wrote down word for word the entire Talmud in that period with Rashi's commentary. It's an incredible. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses have a little over 300,000 letters in them. The Talmud is 100 times the size, and takes the Torah scroll. It takes about a year for a scribe to write a Torah scroll. Imagine the amount of work that goes into writing a copy of the Talmud, and that was considered the biggest enemy of the church, the Catholic Church, the Talmud. And even to this day, you'll see anti-Semites talking about the Talmud. You'll see it coming from the right and from the left and from the center. The Talmud is so hated by the anti-Semites because they realize that the Jewish people's survival depends on their books. A used bookseller once told me, who deals with all sorts of books, secular and Jewish, he said, any new book that comes out, secular book, a new novel, whatever, within a few months you can get it in a used bookstore. Because people read the novel, and then that's it, and they get rid of it. They'll sell it. He says, you can't get Jewish books, Torah books, in the used bookstores, who knows for how long it takes until you can get one. Why? Because most people who have Jewish books don't part with them. Even after they finish reading it, if they do finish reading it, they're not going to give it away because it's a treasure that they want to keep in their homes. My biggest culture shock was a rabbinical student. Was during the summer, we used to travel to different cities, small towns especially, in different states. I was in the state of Washington, Oregon, and Illinois, and Maryland. And we used to look for Jewish names, and we would knock on the door and come in and have a conversation with the Jewish people to take the pulse of Jewish life all over the country. And the thing that shocked me, coming from yeshiva and very, very narrow origin, where when I grew up, all I saw was books in my house, and my father was constantly buying new books, and the same thing is true with all the people that I knew. And here I walk into houses and I don't see any books. I couldn't understand, how could you have a home without books? It's like not having people in the home, building a house, and not having anyone living there. So where does this passion come from? Why is it so crucial to Jewish life to have books? So it all starts with a commandment in the Torah. In the end of Deuteronomy, God commands the Jewish people to write the Torah, put the Torah into writing. The Torah, when we say the Torah, we're talking about the 5 books of Moses. And from that time onward, it became a well-known commandment that you're supposed to have Torah scrolls. In those days, before printing presses and even way before that, the only way people could study Torah was to have a Torah scroll, and that's how they would study Torah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
When you say that in terms of written in Deuteronomy, isn't the Shema? The Shema says you will teach your children in the morning.
But it doesn't say to write it.
Right, but it says that you will teach them. It makes a point of the importance of teaching.
Obviously, right. But when did the written word become so important that it became a commandment? You have to write Torah scrolls. And the Torah says the reason for that, so you should be able to learn Torah. A written word is going to help you with the learning, because transmitting things orally has its limits. However, that changed because about in the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, we spoke about this many times, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, realized that if the Torah, the oral Torah, would remain oral, because most of the teachings of Judaism are not in the written Torah, not in the 5 books of Moses. 5 books of Moses is only an outline. It doesn't give you the details. It doesn't explain the concepts. So the oral Torah was passed down orally. That's the way it was intended to be. But he realized that if they keep on doing it orally, when Jews are now scattered all over the world, the Roman Empire was taking Jews to the far-flung corners of the world, the Torah would not be preserved. Because if you're not close to the centers of learning, if you're not living all together where you teach Torah collectively, people are going to not learn and they're going to forget, and the teachings of the Torah will be lost. So he put part of the oral law into writing in what we call the Mishnah. And then later on, the rabbis in Babylonia and also in Israel began to study the Mishnah and come up with their commentary to the Mishnah. And that became a written document. And from that time onward, the oral Torah has continued to spread and to increase to the point that today we have hundreds of thousands of books that are commentary on the Torah, on the Talmud, on the Mishnah, on all the other different aspects of Jewish learning. Yes?
Is any book that's a commentary on Torah considered oral Torah?
Yeah, but it's not. It's no longer oral. It's no longer oral. It now became part of the written tradition. So now, how do we fulfill this commandment to write the words of the Torah? And originally, that meant to write a Torah scroll. That was the only written document that we had as Jews. So we had a commandment to write the Torah. But now that we have much more than just the 5 books of Moses and the rest of the biblical literature, we have the Mishnah, the Talmud, the commentaries, the philosophy of Judaism, and all the other aspects of Judaism, of Jewish knowledge. The Rosh is an acronym for Rabbi Usher of 13th century. He was one of the greatest Jewish leaders of that time and authorities of Jewish law. So he writes, now we fulfill this mitzvah by having all Torah books, not just the 5 books of Moses, not just a Torah scroll, but any time that we purchase, not just writing, anytime we purchase a Jewish book, when the definition of a Jewish book is not a novel that includes a Jewish individual, a Jewish protagonist, but it means something about Jewish ideas, Jewish values based on the Torah. Anytime we buy such a book, we fulfill this biblical commandment of writing down these words. It's no longer restricted to the Torah scroll. Now, there are some opinions who say we still have a mitzvah to write a Torah scroll. So how come in this room, how many of us have written their own Torah scroll? Raise your hand. All of you who have written your own Torah scroll.
Have you done one?
I didn't raise my hand either, because I haven't written one. I couldn't write one. I'm not a scribe. So how do we fulfill that obligation? So
Download it. Did you say download it?
So we fulfill it by purchasing, when the Torah scroll is being written, purchasing a letter. That's one way of doing it. But the primary obligation we fulfill through buying Jewish books, Torah books. Rashi, in his commentary to Ethics of the Fathers, if you remember, we had a class in Ethics of the Fathers not too long ago, where it says you shall acquire a friend. Make for yourself a teacher and acquire a friend. So literally that means you should have colleagues. You should have people with whom you share knowledge. Rashi says it means you should have books. Your books are your friend. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for buying, knei, also comes from a word reed. A reed was used as a pen. That your pen is your friend. When you write down the words of Torah, that's your friend. There's also in Ethics of the Fathers, right before that, it says your home should be a home of the gathering of the sages. Now, not everyone here has the opportunity to invite sages to discuss Torah in their home. The second best thing over there is to have the sages speak through their writings. So having Torah books in your home. The Rebbe started 10 mitzvah campaigns. He added more to the 10, but the 10 initial ones include, one of them was to have a house full of books. Not just to have some books, but to fill your house with books. And the Rebbe explained that means literally have many books, but also figuratively it means let the books fill your house. Let them define what kind of a house you have. A house that is devoted to this Torah knowledge. So that the books are not just there for show. You know, they say the guy wants to the bookstore, he says, I need 3 feet of book covers because I have to put them in my bookcase. It's 3 feet wide. I don't need the book, just the covers. No, that's not what we mean by this. You have to have the books, and the books should be used, hopefully, at least occasionally. The first word of the 10 Commandments in Hebrew is Anochi, I. The Talmud says that the word Anochi is an acronym for Ana, I, this is Aramaic, Napshi, myself, Kesavis, inscribed, Yehavis, and gave it. That means I have inscribed myself in this written text that I gave you. That when you study Torah, God is the author, He is present in the text, so you're getting God through the text. By extension, we could say the same thing about a person who writes a book. A person who is a spiritual person is inscribing himself in that book. So when you read that book, you're not just reading a book about something that someone wrote, you're getting the author with the book as well. So when you read Torah, you're getting Moses. God, of course, is the ultimate author. When you read Talmud, you're getting the authors of the Talmud. And since the Talmud is based on the oral tradition, it's part of God's communication at Mount Sinai. the halachic authorities, the ones who deal with Jewish law, talk about a person who can't afford to buy books, but they have to give charity. Even if you're poor, you have to give charity. You have to give something. Ideally, one should give 10% to 20% of their income, of their net income. Could you use the money designated for charity to buy Jewish books? So there's a discussion about this and different opinions about it, but it seems that the consensus is that if you don't have any other way of buying the books, you could use charity money designated for charity, but the condition is they have to be used. You can't just buy books with charity money to put them in the bookcase. You have to use them, and you have to share them with others. You have to be able. You have to say, whoever wants to borrow my book should come and borrow it. And some say you should even write on the book that these books were purchased with tzedakah, just in case, if God forbid a person passes away and the children inherit the books, they'll think it's their books. It's not theirs. It belongs to the community if you use your tzedakah money to buy books. A Torah book is considered to be holy, and it deserves to be treated with respect. A 12th century work, a very classic work called Sefer Hasidim, a rabbi in Germany, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, he was called, and he writes that you have an obligation to protect the honor of Jewish books. For example, if you have 5 books of Moses, or any other Jewish book, you can't put things on it. Let's say you want to put your glasses down. You can't put your glasses on the book. Now, if you're in the middle of learning and you take off your glasses, that's one thing. But if after you finish learning and you put the book down, you can't put anything on top of that book. You can't put your wallet, your glasses, your handkerchief, whatever it is. It's not respectful to put that on your book.
Rabbi, I have a question for you.
Sure.
My understanding was, when it comes to a chumash, that's the case. Is that also the case of Shulchan Aruch, Siddur, anything else?
Yes, any Torah book is in that category. Now, there are different degrees of holiness. Yes. You can't put any Torah book on top of the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books
on top of a siddur.
But you could put the 5 books of Moses on top of a prayer book. And there's a whole hierarchy of what is considered to be more dramatically holy and deserves more respect. When the Torah scroll is taken out of the ark, everyone stands. When you take a volume of the Talmud out of the bookcase, you don't have to stand. It's not that the Talmud is less holy, but it's less dramatically holy, because the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, record God's very communication. But anyhow, that's a separate subject. You can't sit on a chair that has a Torah book on it. You can't put a Torah book on the ground. If a Jewish book, a Torah book, when I say Jew, yes?
Is there a certain order also? You said you're not allowed to put the handkerchief on, but you're not allowed to put a siddur on top of that.
Right, that's what we were just referring to before, that the 5 books of Moses comes first. Then any book that has God's name, like a siddur, would become next. Then you have the Mishnah, then the Gemara, and then later books. If a Torah book, which we call a sefer is book, literally, but referring to the Torah book, if it falls on the ground, when you pick it up, you give it a kiss. Just like if your little 2-year-old falls on the ground, you pick it up, what do? You kiss the 2-year-old.
You can put a siddur on top of the Gemara?
There's some dispute about that, if the Siddur, which comes first, Siddur or the Gemara. Some say the Siddur because it has God's name in it. The Gemara does not have God's name in it. Now, if a Sefer is upside down, you should turn it right side up. If 2 people are walking, they come into your doorway, you want to know who should come first, and one of them is carrying a Jewish book, he goes first. Not of respect to the person, but of respect to the fact that he's carrying a holy book. If there's, God forbid, a fire, the first thing you save, and this is relevant today, unfortunately. Right, the first thing you save are the Torah books. Obviously, the lives come first, before everything. But after your lives are secure and you want to save something, you save your Torah books before anything else. Yes?
Rabbi, what do you do with having 5 books of Moses? You use it. After a while, the pages start.
Okay, we'll get to that in a moment.
What do you do with that book?
We'll get to it in a moment. Yeah, we'll talk about it. They saved the Torah, so that's what I heard.
Yeah, and Pasadena too, they showed the Pasadena Jewish shul, they showed the rabbi's house and her dining room table with the...
Yeah. Yeah, that's the first thing you save are the Torah scrolls, and then other Jewish books if they're there. You shouldn't use a Torah book, to defend yourself, unless your life is in danger. It's funny, but unfortunately, these were real issues throughout Jewish history. People had to defend themselves. Don't use a book to cover yourself from the rain or the sun. If ink drips on your clothing and on a Torah book, wipe the Torah book first. You can't use one Torah book to support another, to use it as a support. While you're learning, that doesn't apply. In other words, I have a volume of the Talmud open and I'm looking at commentaries, and I can put it on the Talmud, but when I put it away, I have to separate them. One has more holiness than the other. When one hands a sefer to another, do it with the right hand. Anytime we do a mitzvah, we're supposed to do it with our right hand. Unless you're left-handed, that becomes your right hand. The right, it's more respectful to do it with your right hand. When people would come to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would give $1 or give a cup of some wine, and you would stretch out your left hand, the Rebbe would sometimes tell you, do it with your right hand. Although I know people who are left-handed that the Rebbe wouldn't tell them that. If you have to sell your belongings to pay your debts, the last thing you should sell are your Torah books. Now, what happens if your books get worn out, as you just asked? So you don't have to keep them that way. You can have them buried. But there's a big mistake, people think, that you can just throw them into the grave. No, you can't throw them into the grave. You have to put them in a bag or in a box. It has to be done respectfully. And it should be done... Unfortunately, I think people made a mistake. This is my opinion, it's wrong. People do it, they bury it in graves where people are actually buried. That's not necessarily the proper thing. It's only proper if the books are really holy books. Sometimes people just throw anything that has any Jewish sign on it, and the person has to be known as a righteous person. Otherwise, it's not respectful for the person or for the books. You can't just dump the books into the grave, which I saw happening here in Buffalo, which is wrong. Now, as I mentioned before, the enemies of the Jewish people knew what our strength was. That our strength was our teachings of Torah, and particularly the teachings of Torah that were in books. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX had the books, Jewish books, burned. 1244, Clemens IV, that's what I referred to before, 24 wagon loads burnt in Paris. And that's what we lament on Tisha B'Av, the day of national mourning. We're mourning the destruction of the temple and the ensuing exile. One of the things that we cry over is the loss of these books. In Germany in the 16th century, there was a whole big thing between a man called Pfefferkorn, Johannes Pfefferkorn, who was a Jewish apostate. He was a Jew who became a Christian and became one of the worst anti-Semites. And he had a big debate with a righteous Gentile whose name was Johannes Ruchlin. Ruchlin was well-versed in Hebrew. He was able to study Jewish texts from the original. And he defended Judaism. He defended the Talmud. Even though he was a observant Catholic, he defended Judaism, and he ultimately won and prevailed that he shouldn't destroy the books in Germany, and he endangered his own life. Another phenomenon occurred, especially in the 19th century, called censors. The government would not allow you to publish books unless it was reviewed by a censor. Now, initially the censors were not Jewish, so they didn't really know what they were censoring because they couldn't read the original. But then they got Jews. One of them was a man called the name of Tugendhold. I think I still have it, but I know there are volumes of the Talmud where you look on the cover, the opposite of the cover page, and it will have the name Tugendhold there. That means he approved the publishing of that text, that he went through it to make sure there was nothing against Christianity, nothing against the government, and he was a Jewish apostate, so he wasn't really interested in helping the Jews. And as a result, many of the publishing houses in Russia were shut down for many years. They didn't allow the printing, especially of Hasidic texts, because they considered Hasidic texts to be superstitious, spiritual. They didn't like spirituality. So they closed the printing houses. There was a famous incident with the Shapiro brothers. These were two sons of one of the great Hasidic masters, or Pinchas of Koretz. And they were very righteous people in their own right, and they were accused of murder because one of the people who worked in their printing houses committed suicide, and they were accused of committing the murder, and they were sentenced to prison. The story is told that they were given lashes. There were 2 rows of soldiers with whips, and they had to, without clothing on, they had to go through the whipping, and they would be whipped. So the longer it would take, the more pain they would suffer. And while one of them was going through, they managed to bribe the officials to be able to wear their yarmulke. So they didn't have clothing, but they had yarmulkes on. And one of the whips knocked off his yarmulke. He refused to go any further. So he's being whipped constantly. And miraculously, they both survived. They were ill for months and months. They also had a Torah scroll written in prison. I don't remember all the details how that happened, but that Torah scroll was passed down generations, and it was finally given to the Rebbe. The Rebbe would dance with it on Simchas Torah. That's the Torah scroll that was written by the Shapiro brothers in prison. So they devoted their lives to printing volumes of the Talmud. If you have a set of Talmud printed by them in the city of Slavita, that's in Ukraine, I believe, you can get tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. It's considered to be a very special edition of the Talmud. And there were court cases, actually. When the Shapiro brothers printed an edition of the Talmud, they invested a fortune into it. What would happen if a few years later someone else decides to print another edition of the Talmud that would put them out of business? So that the custom was that when you printed a book, any book, you would get approbations, endorsements from great rabbis, and the main reason for it was not just to say that the book is a good book, to give a good review, that too, but was also to say the book is being published on this and this day. For the next 5 years, no one has a right to publish this book without the permission of the publishers. And that was a way to protect. And what happened was a new publishing house opened in Vilna, and it was competing with the Slavita version of the Talmud. So the people who published the Slavita edition went to rabbis, and there was a big dispute amongst the greatest rabbis of that time if the Vilna press had a right to compete with the Slavita press, and they made a compromise that the Vilna publishers had to purchase all the unsold copies of the other one, so they shouldn't suffer a loss. So this was a major dispute which concerning the publishing of books. Maharam of Rottenburg, he was a 12th, 13th century leading rabbi in Germany. He was very famous for many things, but the thing that's historically most famous about him is that he was arrested and put in prison, and they demanded a huge ransom to get him out. And he said, no, I will not allow myself to be ransomed, because if they will be able to take huge amounts of money to get rabbis out of prison, no rabbi will be safe in Germany. They're going to arrest all of them and impoverish the Jewish community. So he said, no, I will not be ransomed. He passed away in prison, and his body remained in prison for, I think, 14 years, until finally someone, whether the rabbi couldn't protest anymore, someone ransomed his body, and that's how he was buried. This is known as the Maharam, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. So he said that when a community puts taxes on people for their possessions, you can't tax books. As a general rule, books were not given away after death, but inherited. There are some exceptions to that. And it's interesting how Jewish sources talk about theft of books. Now, why would anyone want to steal a book to study Torah? He's studying Torah, but he's stealing the book.
Because he doesn't have it.
He doesn't have it, obviously. So one day, visiting Attica, a guy gives me a volume of the Talmud. I think it was an English translation. And he told me to give it back to the. It was taken from a Jewish school. I should give it back to the school. So, and my son Levi, as a chaplain in prison, also had that incident. Someone had a volume, a Torah text. I forgot which one it was, and my son asked him where did he get it, and he admitted that he was in a bookstore and he. He was looking around, and the owner said to him, "Could I help you?" He says, "No, I'll help myself." And he did. So you have to ask the question, why would anyone who's interested in learning Torah steal a book? But apparently books were so important to people that they didn't even realize the contradiction involved.
We talk about bookstores. How come bookstores charge sales tax now? If you specifically say there's no tax.
Because the government requires it. If they wouldn't charge sales tax, they would be closed down by the government. Now, if you belong to a religious organization, you're tax exempt. But if it's not a religious organization, you have to pay taxes. He's talking about the Jewish community that taxed people. They wouldn't tax them for because Jews had a certain amount of autonomy in the Middle Ages. When they weren't being persecuted and they weren't being pogromed, they would have autonomy, and you couldn't use their possessions of books as a reason for taxation.
Could you use books for you borrow money and you give it as a surety to pay the loan back?
That's a good question.
What was the question?
Could you use it as collateral? Let's say you borrow money from someone, the person says, well, how do I know you'll get the money back? So you take my books. And if I don't see why you can't do that. You could sell your books. There's no law that you can't sell them. A Torah scroll you're not allowed to sell, but any other book you could sell. So if you could sell it, you can use it to repay a debt.
I'm sure a lot of Torah scrolls have been sold.
I'm sure it has happened. But you can only tell us, the only time you can sell a Torah scroll is for studying Torah. Let's say a person wants to go to a school where they charge tuition and they wouldn't take him without tuition. And you have a Torah scroll that's worth the amount of money you're allowed to, because the whole purpose of the Torah is to study Torah. If you can't study Torah, what purpose is the Torah? And to get married. If you need the money to be able to get married, you can sell it for marriage. Or, of course, to save a life, ransom someone who's in prison. That's an obvious exception.
Can you study from the sacred Torah?
Okay, that's a good question. There are those who say you shouldn't, even though in the olden days that's the way people studied. That was then, but now the Torah scroll is used for a communal service and it shouldn't be used for private study. There are different opinions about that, but it's generally accepted. You don't use the Torah scroll. You don't take it out for no good reason. The Sfarim dealer, the one who sells Sfarim, is considered to be engaged in a religious act. It's not called business. It's a religious act. And when you're involved in a religious act, you're exempted from other mitzvahs. In other words, let's say you are involved in a communal service or helping people, and the time for reading the Shema has come, but you can't do both at the same time, although most people have enough time to do both. It's very rare to find a person who's so involved in doing what they're doing that they can't take off a minute to read the Shema. But theoretically, if you're involved in communal work, while you're involved, you're exempted from other mitzvahs. There's a general principle in the Talmud. When you're engaged in one mitzvah, you're exempted from another. When you finish doing it, then the obligation resumes.
Hashgacha is a good example. If you have a copy, you can't go off in the corner and dive.
Right. That would be a good example. So this forum dealer is considered to be engaged in a religious act. Now he can't take off a few minutes. If he can take off a few minutes, then it doesn't exempt him. In 1655, this is after the massacres, I call it pogroms, but it's really the major massacres, the biggest massacre of Jews from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple until the Holocaust was in 1648 and 1649. Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian leader, wiped out countless Jewish communities and impoverished them in addition. So the appeal came from Jewish community leaders to not hesitate to publish books and even compel communities to provide books. Even though there were so many, the Jews were in such a bad situation economically, but books were so important that took precedence. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, that's when an explosion of publishing of Jewish books. And you know who owned most of these publishing houses? Non-Jews. Non-Jews owned the publishing houses to publish Jewish books because it was a lucrative business. Because they knew the Jews are going to buy books.
Is there any opposition to the use of printing presses to produce books?
Of using printing presses?
Yeah, for example, there were arguments about using machines to make matzah.
They're not the same. It's not the same. I never heard of anyone opposing printing books. No, I never heard. Now, the first Jewish books came out in 1475. They printed a copy of Rashi. Then the Turim. Turim is a collection of Jewish laws. And these are called the Incanabula. Those are the books that were printed in the 15th century, the first century, 15th, 16th century. And then it spread all over Europe. Then we have a few more things about lending books. The Talmud says that when the Torah talks about tzedakah, charity, it's talking about a form of tzedakah where you lend books to others. You publish books or you buy the books and you lend it to others. The 10th century, 11th century Rabbi Shmuel Hanagid would hire scribes to write books and distribute them. He was very wealthy. He was a minister of finance in the country in which he lived, in Spain, and he was able to afford, and he would hire people to write books. I don't know who said this quote. I don't remember who said it. Maybe it's Shmuel Hanagid. Even if you get into a fight with someone, don't refrain from lending books. Keep the dispute outside of the books area. The 12th century Sefer Hasidim writes something that women refused to buy personal items when they were short of cash, but would spend their money on books to lend to others. There are some halachic ramifications, practical ramifications. If you have something in your house and someone says it's mine, usually the fact that it's in your house proves that it's yours. How did it get to your house? Unless you are someone in Attica, usually it doesn't happen, it doesn't move. Books don't move. But in this case, books do move because people do borrow and lend books. This became such a... Nowadays you don't see it so much, but in those days that was a very common thing. What happens if someone owes you money and you have their books? And you might say, you know what? The books are worth $1,000. He owes me $1,000. I'll keep the books, and that way I'll get my debt paid. No, you shouldn't do that. Don't mix the two. Take him to court. He owes you the money. Do whatever you have to do to get the money back, but don't penalize the books. Don't take away the books from him.
Well, in the example we asked before about collateral, so if somebody gave you sperm for collateral and then you paid the loan, you paid a loan.
Right.
So what's the status of the collateral since it's...
So legally speaking, the collateral belongs to the person, to the creditor, to get back his money. But morally speaking, he shouldn't withhold that for the debt. He should let him get back his money, his books. And finally, the Rosh, the 13th century rabbi, agreed to fine a person, to impose a fine on a person who refused to lend his Sfarim. Again, the Jewish community had a certain amount of autonomy, and they were able to fine people. So we would fine people who would hoard their books and not allow any other people. So anyone who wants to borrow any books from my library is welcome to come and borrow. Any questions?
A little off the beaten track of this. Were there ever conflicts about what the actual Torah said or was written? You know, the actual text of it.
Of what? The 5 books of Moses?
Yes.
Are there any questions about how it was written? Well,
No, not how it was written, but, you know, maybe one group said, oh, I think this is what's written in
Example,
some...
Chabad Sefer Torah as opposed to Retevani Sefer Torah against...
Okay, Torah scrolls are basically uniform. The Yemenite Torah scrolls have a few slight variations. In other words, the precise nature of the Torah scroll was preserved through thousands of years to the point where it's literally almost, you can't tell the difference. There's I know in one case in the book of Deuteronomy there's a question whether you write a word with an aleph at the end or a hey at the end, and there were two customs about that.
I mean, when there are always different opinions, it seems like everything here is different.
Almost no different opinions. Even the Samaritans, who have their own version of the Torah, their version is almost identical to ours. Even though they separated themselves from the Jewish people, that was preserved almost perfectly. Yeah.
In Soviet Union was law what some stuff what to make before 1947 you cannot take with you when you leave Soviet Union.
Right.
No, for example, I could not take my violin because it was 1780. So I have to live in Soviet Union. Same happened with books. On this law, I think on this law, when start to talk Hasidic, what has in the Soviet Union, and Putin didn't give permission to...
Referring to another library of the Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law had his library that he took out of the Soviet Union in 1929. The Rebbe's father-in-law's father had a library, I think of about 12,000 books and manuscripts that was confiscated in World War I. And that library is still in Russia, and Putin won't allow it to be taken out and returned to the Rebbe's library. That's still outstanding. It's still, I mean, people are still trying to. American courts ruled that they have to give, and they penalized Russia because they didn't return the library. But that's a separate library that also belongs to the Rebbe's library, but it comes through it was a different part of the library.
But it's Museum of Tolerance Museum.
Right, so Putin made a concession that he put the library in a museum that was built, a museum to commemorate the Holocaust. So I don't know if the whole library, but at least part of it was put in that museum. And people have access to it, but he refuses to return it. Maybe that's why he's having problems.